I want to meet the guy who says, you know what might be fun? Raising a cougar as a pet. I must take a particular individual who doesn't mind having to buy a lot of horse meat.
Yeah, and then finding out that this is just something they can't handle, and
Yeah,
what do
really.
they do with it?
This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Technically, Eastern Cougars still prowl the Maine woods. It's a federally endangered species in Maine, which means that somebody has to pay attention to them. Mark McCullough is that somebody. He's the endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Maine. There are plenty of reasons to think that the cougars are not here, but also some reasons to suspect they could get here. Truthfully, every time we think they are finally gone from Maine forever, one shows up. It could be a wanderer or a released animal, but they've not been declared extinct in the state. In fact, a lot of Mainers think they've seen one. You may be surprised to find out that is possible. And you should also know what to do if you think you do see one. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, Doors Equipment, and EBS. And without further ado, we go to the headquarters of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Mark McCullough, welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine.
Oh, it's nice to be here, Bob. Thank you.
You are the endangered species biologist for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the state of Maine. What endangered species are you dealing with? And we've talked in the past about bumblebees and maybe piping plovers. And is there a whole suite of them in Maine that you're in charge of?
Well, there's actually not that many federally listed species in Maine compared to other states around the country. But some of the better-known ones you've just mentioned, the piping plover, the roseate tern, are on the federal list. Also the Canada lynx, the gray wolf, which may or may not be here from time to time. And then we have a couple of endangered plants. We have a very unique plant called the Furbish's lousewort, which occurs up on the St. John River. But what's unique is that it's the only place in the world that plant is found. Mm-hmm. We have 2 orchids that are on the federal list here, the small world Begonia and the Eastern Prairie orchid. The Eastern Prairie orchid is found up in Aroostook County at a single site, and the small world Begonia at a number of sites down in southern Maine.
And I've never even heard of those.
Yeah, but they're beautiful plants, and orchids are beautiful plants, and we have them here in Maine.
And on the other hand, the furbished lousewort was really controversial back when they wanted to put a dam up there in that river.
Oh, you know about that.
I've been here a long time. I'm getting way old.
Yeah, a lot of people. That was actually one of the first plants, the first group of plants listed on the federal endangered species list back in 1973. And as you just inferred, it played an instrumental role in stopping the Dickey-Lincoln Dam on the St. John River. And it's been on our list ever since, and we've been working with the Maine Natural Areas Program to try to monitor its populations and figure out ways to try to ensure it has a future here in Maine.
That was back in, I think, the mid-'70s?
It was,
God,
yeah.
how old am I? Oh, man. Well, Eastern Cougars. That's a species that probably isn't in Maine anymore. In fact, it's a question of whether it's just gone altogether.
Yeah, so the Eastern Cougar is one of the species that we have on our list here in Maine because it did occur here at one time. And that is the central question is, does it still occur? Again, it was another one of those species, very first put on the federal list back in 1973. And so ever since then, the Eastern Cougar subspecies, there's been a raging debate about whether it still occurs here in eastern North America. And the Fish and Wildlife Service, for better or for worse, asked me if I wanted to be the lead biologist for the Eastern Cougar.
Boy, you do take the tough ones, don't you?
And in a moment of weakness, I said, yeah, I'll do that. That sounds interesting. They say, well, we would like you to review the status of the Eastern Cougar and answer this question scientifically. Does it still occur? Mm-hmm. And if it does, then maybe we should be doing some things to protect and enhance its populations. And if it doesn't, well, then maybe we ought to take it off the federal endangered species list. So in my simple mind, I thought, well, this is pretty easy to do. I mean, what could be published on the Eastern Cougar? Not very much information. But you see you see boxes in my office
all
here.
Over the place in here.
Actually, down the hall, I have a whole file section of filing that is all the literature and historic and current information I found about Eastern Cougars. But we can talk about where that led us eventually.
Well, let's talk about the policy behind this, because there's significance to declaring something as being no longer here, extinct. In the East, there's first of all, there's the heartbreak of you just lost a species, you idiot. But there's also the fact that there's regulatory matters that go on because of this designation, and that changing the designation changes how things might be regulated.
Yeah, so any animal that's on the federal endangered species list has some significant protections behind it. In fact, it's the Endangered Species Act is considered one, if not the most strongest environmental law that we have federally. So it provides protection for those animals from what we call take, which basically means you can't kill them. They can't be trapped. They can't be sold. They can't be moved from one place to another. But beyond that, the Endangered Species Act also requires that all federal projects, whether it requires a federal permit or whether there's some kind of federal funding involved, they all must be reviewed to make sure that no federally listed species are adversely affected or even their future jeopardized by these particular projects. And that's where we were talking about the Dickey-Lincoln Dam and how a federally listed species can in some cases prevent projects from happening. But in most cases, as a biologist, we're able to work with developers and find ways to be compatible, have compatible development and still have our species present. We're
actually seeing a lot of that trend happening. I think Endangered Species Act for a long time was thou shalt not.
Yeah.
But there's now, I think, a trend of really working with landowners much more. And I'm thinking out in the West where they have prairie chicken challenges. There's a lot of habitat out there that is very valuable to the ranchers and farmers that you don't want to screw up, but they've got endangered species there. How do you deal with it? It's much more cooperative, I think, than it once was.
Yeah, and that's, I think, the way that we would like to see the Endangered Species Act work into the future, instead of being a thou shalt not type of legislation, to be one that where it brings people together to talk about the needs of some of these rare species and to try to find solutions to be able to conserve these species but still allow development or certain types of land use like ranching or forestry to continue. And I would say, given my experience as an endangered species biologist, 99 out of 100 times you can find those solutions. So that's sort of our challenge is when we embark on one of these projects, is to try to find that common ground.
Well, as a matter of fact, that justifies the existence of biologists, because you need somebody who's an expert on these animals in order to figure out how to preserve them.
Exactly. Yeah, you need to know their habitat. What activities might be limiting them. Where are the important areas for them, and can we work around that? Can we still make some kinds of development happen and still have these species present?
You see a lot of that with reptiles and amphibians in Maine right now. We talk a lot about vernal pools and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Because it turns out they're much more valuable than we ever realized, and they're easy to bulldoze.
Yeah, but you can still develop to a certain extent around them, and I think Maine Fish and Wildlife has developed these ways to compromise and to figure out, okay, what is the most important area of forest around the vernal pool, and then can we put a couple of houses in here or build a road nearby and still be able to maintain the value of those vernal pools. So
yeah, we're getting better at sharing our sandbox with others.
yeah. I think in our simplistic world, we biologists would all like to have work in a wilderness setting where animals and biologists have all of this habitat, but that's not the reality.
We're back in the office of Mark McCullough. He's the endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Maine. We'll be talking cougars in a moment. Do we have them or don't we? We do have Canada lynx. I'll be asking him about that a few times during the show, including when we return in a moment. You're listening to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. It's Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Mark McCullough is the endangered species biologist in Maine working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Technically, eastern cougars are not extinct in Maine. If one shows up, it's Mark's job to follow up. The Canada lynx is also a federally listed species in Maine, so are you the lynx guy too, Mark?
I am.
You are?
Yes. Yeah.
So you get to deal with that too.
Yeah. So that was part of the request that I work on the Eastern Cougar as well. You know a bit about wildcats. Maybe you could take the Eastern Cougar issue on.
Well, that's a good example of why it matters if you declare the Eastern Cougar extinct. You take the Canada lynx situation where we have challenges over trapping.
Right.
If you say that this animal still exists, therefore you can't do these certain types of activities, including trapping, that's one thing. If you say it no longer exists, then that opens up what you can do with trapping. So there's a regulatory element in here that changes with the designation.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Although I would have to say with the Eastern Cougar, I think most biologists like myself and Fish and Wildlife Service biologists and other field offices in other states here in the East have sort of been thinking for a couple of decades, this animal is no longer present. Mm-hmm. So when we get a project that requires that type of federal review under the Endangered Species Act, I don't think there have been many recent cases where the Eastern Cougar was taken very seriously as a species that could be present. Simply isn't the data or the information to show that they regularly occur or that there's a population in the East still. So those federal protections, I think we've been thinking a long time about easing back on those.
Mm-hmm. People in Maine still think they see cougars, though.
Oh, they do, yeah, and they do. Mm-hmm. I mean, as a biologist, I would acknowledge that from time to time, people are seeing cougars, and there's a lot of conspiracy theory that government is, knows that they're here and they won't believe us. But I think the cougar that was recently killed on a highway in Milford, Connecticut, a couple of years ago, taught us a valuable lesson that these animals can travel long distances and that they can be here, and that we should, as biologists, be serious when we get reports of cougars. Now, that said, the research that I was able to do for our status review of the cougar, a couple of scientists have shown pretty conclusively that about 95% of the cougar reports in eastern North America have proven to be other species of wildlife, whether it be a white-tailed deer that ran across the road quickly, or a black cat, or a fisher, or a black bear. But people see things and they have mistaken identity of what they've seen. There are times that it really is a cougar.
But mostly it's a fisher. It seems like fishers fool people all the time.
Yeah.
Am I right?
Well, yeah, there's a thing that goes on in our brain, and it's interesting as a species. When we see something quickly, we try to identify it. As a birder, you probably have experienced this. An accipiter flies quickly across a trail, and all the birders see it. Well, that was a sharpshin. No, it was a Cooper's. Well, I thought it was a goshawk, and we want to try to pigeonhole and identify that. There's something about our brains that just won't let that go and say, I don't know what it was. But it's the same with cougars, too. When I get cougar reports, and I've gotten many over the years, probably dozens, if not hundreds, is, I ask them first, well, how long did you see it? And oftentimes it's just, well, I think maybe 1 or 2 seconds, ran across the road. Well, what time of day was it? It was, 11 o'clock at night. And you have to wonder, what how well could you identify something that you saw that for that short a period of time?
I'm going way out on a limb on this, but this should be fun. I'm thinking there must be an evolutionary reason why we need to identify things so quickly, because you look at animals in the landscape right now. A peregrine falcon versus a merlin, which is a smaller falcon, can fly over a marsh. Birds out there that could be eaten by either of these have to identify right away whether they're threatened, and I mean instantly. So you will watch a merlin fly over and none of the ducks leave. Mm-hmm. You watch a peregrine come in and instantly all the teal are gone. So there has to, and I mean, people had to understand whether that was a garter snake or a rattlesnake they were seeing very, very quickly. So instinctively, we must have that hardwired need to know.
Yeah, I think it's in the back of there where our reptilian brain is, that we need to do this. Mm-hmm. And it's just been an interesting part of studying this phenomenon of the Eastern Cougar.
Mm. So let's back up for a second. Eastern Cougar, mountain lion, Florida Panther, what's the difference?
None.
They're all the same species,
yeah.
but subspecies.
In fact, I'd add another one that was the preferred name in New England here was the catamount.
I was wondering if you were going to mention that one.
And here in Maine, if you look at Bill Crone's book, Early Maine Wildlife, mm-hmm. you find out that early writers had other names for them here in Maine. One was the Lunkasoo, which was a Native American name. Another one was the Indian Devil, which was a name given sort of broadly to either cougars or lynx sometimes affirmation for bobcats. But mm-hmm. at any rate, there were a number of terms used to describe this somewhat mysterious animal.
Would there have been any significant differences between mountain lion, Florida panther, cougar, catamount, etc., or were they all basically the same species and not much subspecies difference?
Well, that's an interesting part of this whole story is that once scientists began to look at this in the late 1800s, there were biologists that wanted to lump them all as sort of one species, all cougars in North America be one species, but that's sort of boring, and you don't get your name in scientific publications by doing that. So there were the splitters, those who thought that they could detect tiny differences in the animals here in New England versus Florida versus the Midwest versus up north versus out west, and in fact, over time these biologists named 15 different subspecies of cougars here in North America with tiny little differences that they thought that they could see or measure mm-hmm. on the cougar skulls or in their coloration and so forth. And so that is where we had the Eastern Cougar listed on the federal list as a subspecies. One of these little populations that people thought were slightly different and enough to name them a different subspecies. So the question today is, with our modern genetics and much better ability to measure skulls and so forth, were these truly different subspecies or not? Mm-hmm. And we've sort of answered that question.
Yeah. What was the answer?
Well, a geneticist named Melanie Culver did her doctoral dissertation on this, and she found that all North American cougars were one and the same. There's not much that genetically separates the Eastern Cougar from the cougars in California mm-hmm. or the Florida Panthers. They're all one subspecies, and today most biologists have accepted that.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, they reintroduced as best they could Florida Panther. And if I remember right, and this is again is a hazy memory, most of those or that stock came from Texas.
Well, there were Florida Panthers that remained in Florida. That's the only place in eastern North America that we concluded that there is a mm-hmm. residual population. But they were doing very poorly and suffering from inbreeding. So you're right, they did bring some cougars in from East Texas, just a couple of females, and that made all the difference. Just that new genetic information in the population really helped the Florida Panther to the point now where their populations are up up about 100 to about 150 animals or so.
I'm going to reveal something about myself that I probably shouldn't admit, but I've been fascinated about wildlife for a very long time. And back in the early 70s, I used to go to the Everglades, and we would do what we called snake cruising. Because as the night cooled down, the road would stay warmer, and the snakes would come out there and sit. Yeah. So if you went down the road about 10 miles an hour and looked for the little shadows, you'd find all these great snakes out there in the road. Well, in 1973, while I was doing that, a Florida panther bounds out in front of the car, into the headlights, looks at us, and goes. That's the only panther I've ever seen.
What an incredible experience.
It was cool.
Yeah.
And, of course, I saw all those poisonous snakes out there, too. What a night.
Yeah.
So people do think they see cougars. The one you mentioned that was killed in Connecticut, I believe, had traveled all the way from the Dakotas?
Yeah. So...
Oh, wait. Hold that thought for a moment. We've got to take a break. The case of the traveling cougar when we return in a moment. Plus, if there really was one in Maine, how would you know? With today's cities and highways, plus plains, mountains, and rivers, could a cougar even get to Maine if it wanted to? How many cougars might just be released pets? We got a lot to discuss. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine. Saturday mornings at 9, Sunday mornings at 8 on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. My guest this morning is Mark McCullough, the endangered species biologist for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Maine. Our topic is the Eastern Cougar, which used to be in Maine and, in theory, could still get here. There's a cougar that traveled all the way from South Dakota to Connecticut. So how do we know that?
Genetically now, we have the capability of looking at unique genes for certain populations of cougars. And in that case, we're able to document that cougar came from the Black Hills area of South Dakota and traveled somehow all the way across the country. But amazingly, when they started to piece together, okay, this might have been the same animal that was seen in Wisconsin 8 months ago, which was the same animal that was captured on a trail camera in Minnesota a month before that. And actually a scat was found in northern New York, and further analysis of that showed it was the same animal. So we can put together about 3 or 4 points on the map of how this animal came across North America. And in fact, there's a new book that's been written about this animal, and an amazing journey that it's made. The longest distance dispersal that we know of cougars in North America, but it's called The Heart of the Lion by Will Stolzenberg, and it traces the movements of this animal and the amazing journey it made.
Considering how many deer are in the Middle Atlantic states, you would think there'd actually be movement down here. It's a lot of food.
Yeah. So, that's what some environmental groups have responded to our proposal to take the Eastern Cougar off the list is, well, maybe this is premature. Maybe there is habitat here in the east where these animals could persist. And maybe there's areas with really high deer populations where it would do the environment some good to have a top-level carnivore present on the landscape. So whenever we propose to take an animal off the list, in this case the Eastern Cougar, we have to advertise that in the Federal Register and request public comments. And we've received hundreds of public comments, and many of them are people that are very interested in restoring either wolves or cougars back to the east, where they would play an ecological role in controlling some of these high deer populations.
Right now we're controlling those with the bumpers of our cars.
Yeah, I think that's probably the most effective way. I know many of the states have liberal hunting seasons, but nevertheless, deer populations are very high in parts of the eastern U.S.
Yeah, I mean, you take one of the parkways in Connecticut, Merritt Parkway. It's lined with deer. There are deer carcasses every 100 yards in that damn road.
Yeah. So for a cougar, I suppose that would be a real bonanza.
It would. You'd have to worry about your toddlers, or do you? I mean, what is the history of predation on humans by cats?
I believe this has been recorded. Oh, it does happen, and it's been well documented. And there's been some scientific publications on documenting cougar attacks in North America. I believe there's over 100 attacks that have been well documented, and there have been a number of people that have been killed by cougars. Of course, this occurs mostly now in the West, where there still are populations of cougars. I'm not aware of any attacks here in the East, and not aware of any down in Florida, from the where the Florida panther persists.
No, I don't think I've ever heard any tales there either.
Yeah.
Bears avoid us because we hunt them and they know it. But the cats out west are hunted, and yet they can still look at humans as prey. Are they just not hunted enough?
Yeah, I think what they've found is that most of the cougar attacks have been done by young, dispersing males who are looking for a territory. And so they're out traveling long distances, like this animal that came to Connecticut looking for a territory. They're getting beat up by mature cougars that are already holding territories, and they're having a difficult time finding food and a place to fit in. And there's parts of the West and the Front Range of the Rockies, for example, where there's a lot of people moving up into the mountainsides, building homes, subdivisions, right in cougar territory. This saw a paper recently where there were radio tagged cougars right outside of Boulder, Colorado. They're up in the national forest during the day, and at night they're right in town looking for food. So
I'm not jogging at night, I'll tell you that.
No.
I remember hiking in the Chisos Mountains in Texas once. Got to a mud puddle up on a ridge, and in this mud puddle, there's a bear print and a mountain lion print right next to each other, and they're fresh.
Wow.
So I decided I'm not going off into the woods to take a poop right away, I'll tell you that. The argument about are there still cougars in Maine is usually answered by biologists with the one simple sentence: if they were here, somebody hit one with a car.
Yeah. So part of the work that I did was to talk to other biologists where there are small populations of cougars and say, okay, if there was somehow, some way, a small population of cougars that persisted here in the East, what would you expect to find? Let's say there's 25 animals or less. And folks from Florida, from the Dakotas, told me what you'd expect to find is, yes, animals be hit on the road, first of all. In Florida, every year, where I said there's a population of about 150, some years they have as many as 20 that are killed on the roads there, which is a shame, but it's evidence, obviously, that there's a population there. They say also that they would be caught in traps incidental to trapping for other species. They would be picked up on these hundreds of thousands of trail cameras that are out in the woods, and indeed they have. In fact, some of our best information about their movements in the Midwest comes from trail cameras. But if they were here in Maine, you'd be seeing them. But the big thing in Maine, Bob, that intrigues me about cougars is if they were here, if there was a couple breeding animals, you would find tracks in the snow. And I hardly ever get reports of cougars in the wintertime. They go underground, I guess. But the few that I have, and when I do get a report that sounds intriguing, I will head out if there's snow on the ground to take a look. And what I've found is red fox tracks. I've found coyote tracks. One case, there was a cougar sighted out near Kenduskeg, and I went out and investigated it, and walking all over a farmer's field, and all I could find were coyote tracks. And the farmer stopped by the road and said, "What are you doing out there?" And I explained to him. He laughed and he said, "Oh yeah, there's a big blonde-colored coyote that I see out here all the time." So, that sort of confirms that it's other species of wildlife that are mistaken for cougars. But we rarely get reports in the wintertime when we or Maine Fish and Wildlife could really do a good investigation on snow.
Today's episode of Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is coming to you from the office of Mark McCullough. the endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. If they're hard enough to find in the winter when there can be tracks in the snow, how on earth would you confirm one in the summer? Also in a few minutes, what do you do if you think you see a cougar? Stand by. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. The Eastern Cougar is an endangered species in Maine. Probably it isn't here at all, but it used to be, and we've got enough room and food for it, so scientists haven't officially written it off yet. Furthermore, they are actually seen in Maine sometimes. Some might be released pets that got too big, but it's possible for a cougar to wander here. Tracks in the snow would make it easier to identify, but snow is only around for a few months. In the summer, what would you look for? Hair, scat?
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's really hard unless there's a kill site or something. And we have got reports like that. Somebody finds a dead deer that's partially buried. That's a real behavioral thing that cats do, but bobcats can do that as well. So you would look around for a scat and then maybe be able to have that genetically analyzed. But in the summertime, it's really hard to find tracks. In fact, one of the person who wrote the Eastern Cougar Recovery Plan for the Fish and Wildlife Service, Robert Downing, down in North Carolina, he spent several years following up on cougar reports in the southeast, and he had a really difficult time because it rarely snows, and you rarely can find tracks down there.
Somebody sees what they think is a cougar. What should they do? I mean, how do they report it? What should they look for evidence so they can point it out when you get there? What action should they take?
Well, it'd be wonderful if they could take a picture.
Yes.
And most people have cell phones these days, so that you have potentially the ability to do that right in your pocket. We would love to see photographs. That's much better than these reports that say I just saw something run across the road quickly at night. But yeah, they're welcome to report that to Fish and Wildlife Service or to Maine Fish and Wildlife. They may be disappointed in the response they get. Biologists are really busy. We have limited funding. We can't be out just every day looking for some elusive potential alleged cougar. So we can't follow up on all the reports. But if there's an intriguing track that's seen in the mud or in the snow, take photographs and send them to Maine Fish and Wildlife or to U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
So just a general report might not get you to go out right away, but if they can point out, hey, there's this evidence here that I'm right, that would intrigue you.
Yeah, so for instance, I recall a couple of years ago, somebody said, yeah, I saw this cat. It was on a rock. I can take you right to the rock. We watched it from our house for like a half hour. We're certain it was a cougar. So we went and looked at the rock. We actually found a couple of hairs and were able to have those genetically analyzed, and they turned out to be a bobcat. But, there was enough intrigue and evidence there that we felt confident in doing that. On the other hand, I can recall from many years ago, somebody claimed to have seen a cougar down in Cape Elizabeth, and you would say, Cape Elizabeth? No way. But I believe a Maine Fish and Wildlife warden went to investigate, was in the summer, found hair, had the hair analyzed. At that time, there was not the genetic capability, but just looking at microscopically at the hair, turned out to be a cougar. So, it might have been a released or escaped pet.
Does that
in
happen?
That case? Oh, that happens a lot. So our conclusion of this status review that we did, looking at all the scientific literature, talking to all the states, talking to all the experts, is that the Eastern Cougar is extinct, but that cats do show up from time to time, and they're either animals that are dispersing from the west, like the animal that came to Connecticut, or they're released or escaped pets. And some states have very strict laws, like Maine, against holding cougars in captivity, and others have very lax laws. We sent out a survey to all of the states in the East, 22 different states, asking them, what are your laws regarding keeping cougars as pets, and how many might be registered or known to be in your state? Some states had no idea. Others said there could be several hundred in captivity, and other states like Maine could almost count them on one hand because they just don't condone this practice.
I want to meet the guy who says, you know what might be fun? Raising a cougar as a pet. It must take a particular individual who doesn't mind having to buy a lot of horse meat.
Yeah, and then finding out that this is just something they can't handle, and what do they do with it? And that's where I think in some cases they've been taken to places that are thought to be wild, like Maine, and released.
What was the favorite prey of cougars? Is it deer or hare or something else?
It's deer.
Is it deer?
Yeah, wherever cougars are found in the Americas, and they're found from southern Alaska to Patagonia. They're the most widespread mammal in our hemisphere. But wherever they're found, they have an ungulate that's a major prey item. So it would be deer here in the east. But in the southwest, it might be javelinas. In the northwest, it would be elk and deer. But they require a large ungulate prey.
How far north do they get? Are they widespread through Canada, or is it just too cold?
It is too cold. Not so much the cold, but the snow. They're not well adapted for life in deep snow. And in fact, in parts of the Rockies where they occur, they have to migrate down to lower elevations during the wintertime, along with their ungulate prey. So if you're familiar with Jackson Hole area in Wyoming, the elk come down out of the mountains and are down on the bottomlands for the winter, but the cougars come down as well.
Well, that would seem like the big barrier. People who argue, hey, if they can get here from the west, let them. But the fact is there are huge barriers in the United States. Just crossing the Mississippi wouldn't be easy. Great Plains, the Rockies, all that is just huge barriers. One speculation of why coyotes got here is they were able to go up through Canada, where there's fewer barriers, and get down into Maine from there. Cougars couldn't do that.
I guess I'd disagree. I don't think there are
What?
many. I don't think there are many barriers.
You think not?
And I think
Okay.
this animal moving from the Dakotas to Connecticut showed us that. Yeah, there are interstate highways, but they cross interstate highways all the time in Florida and in the West as well. They may hesitate. It may slow them down, but I think if they really want to go from point A to B, they'll cross an interstate highway. They swim well, so they will cross the Mississippi River, or they'll cross it in places in the winter where it might be frozen. There's parts of the landscape, that are more developed or agricultural that you would think this would be difficult for a cougar to get through. But there's been scientific studies done of the Midwest where we have huge alteration of the landscape, and they've shown that there are corridors that cougars could relatively easily move through the Midwest. Think about a railroad that passes through and it's got brushy habitat along its length for dozens of miles, and a cougar could follow that. They're very adaptable animal. They live in everything from the boreal forest to the open country in the Great Plains to down in South America. They occupy many different kinds of habitats. I think if they have the motivation, they can move through the North American landscape.
Mark McCullough is my guest. He's the endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And technically, the eastern cougar is an endangered species in Maine. There probably aren't any now, but there once was. And if they were significant enough, you would think they would be part of the Indian folklore in Maine. Give me a minute, and we'll see if Mark knows anything about it. Plus, the state also watches over endangered species. How's the overlap? And we'll also get back to Canada Lynx one last time. This is Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. Welcome back to Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine on Sports Radio 92.9 The Ticket. My guest is Mark McCullough, the endangered species biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We're discussing the Eastern Cougar, an animal that is still on the endangered species list in Maine, even though they've probably been eliminated from the state, except for the possibility of a wanderer. They were here, and so there must be some Indian folklore about cougars, Mark.
Well, Bill Crone talks a little bit about some of the old records that he found in his book. I don't think with our knowledge of cougar ecology and what I just talked to you about snow, that we had very many cougars in Maine because it just wasn't really good habitat for them. We didn't have very high deer populations except right along the coast historically. And so there are records of them being here. There's no doubt that they were here. They're probably more abundant over in New Hampshire. There's a lot of records there. In fact, have records right into the 1880s. But from the Native American perspective, again, we have some Native American words like the Lunkasoo that has survived to today, but I'm not aware of very much cultural reference to the cougar here in Maine.
Well, at the Maine Department of Inland Fisheries and Wildlife, I think Wally Jacobus is probably the guy stuck with the cougar.
Wally is. He'd probably have thoughts on both cougars and wolves as well.
What is the jurisdictional overlap between U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Inland Fisheries and Wildlife in the state?
Well, we both work together closely. There's not that many wildlife biologists in the state of Maine, so we really work together closely. The federal government, for instance, provides the state with a lot of funding, in particular funding to work on endangered species. So we really look to the state as being sort of our right arm and being able to get out there and help us protect species, for example, like the piping plover on beaches in southern Maine. So, we work closely together, but our state laws and federal laws are different. We have different jurisdictions as it relates to those laws and how it protects species. So, for example, we have the wolf and the cougar and the lynx federally listed in Maine. If one of those animals, and there are lynx here, but if there were wolves or cougars that showed up, they would be protected, very strictly protected from take, from shooting or killing. Whereas the state doesn't list them. They have a closed season on wolves and cougars, and they may not protect them in exactly the same way as the Endangered Species Act would. So there's a little difference in how those policies play out.
And I'm thinking Canada lynx once again. There's been this controversy over trapping. We don't want lynx taken because it is a federally endangered species in Maine. And so we limit trapping. Now there's this controversy about it.
Well, it's always been controversial. I think folks knew right from the beginning if the lynx were state or federally listed that this conflict with trapping would arise and have to be resolved in some fashion or another. And I guess that's a good example of how we've worked with the state and vice versa. We've developed what we call an incidental take plan for trapping in Maine, which does allow some lynx to be trapped. The Endangered Species Act is flexible enough to allow these plans to be put in place and these exemptions to the take provisions to happen. And so, but it also requires that the state put certain measures in place to minimize that effect or take of lynx. To the maximum extent practicable is what the Act says, and they have to mitigate or compensate for the lynx that might be killed. So we've arrived at a way to allow trapping to continue in Maine, and allow some lynx to be caught, but trying to minimize that injury and take of lynx to the best that we can.
I need to test another one of those things I heard, but I heard that the biggest threat to lynx is actually fishers. Fishers are very good at killing them. If we don't trap as much and we don't catch as many fishers, is there the risk of losing more lynx to fishers that we didn't trap?
Well, that's an interesting argument, and we have a little bit of science to go on. Of course, Maine Fish and Wildlife has done telemetry studies of lynx and documented that quite a few lynx were killed by fishers. And that's sort of an interesting natural history observation that I don't think has been observed in other parts of the United States where lynx occur. Whether or not trapping would remove enough fishers to actually make a difference in that predation rate on lynx, I guess that's where could be argued.
Then there's all the cycles about hare and prey.
Yes.
I see another whole show coming here.
It's complicated. Yeah, the whole hare cycle and whether or not that's occurring or has ever occurred in Maine. All of that. It's a very complicated thing to think about, the future of a lot of our northern wildlife, whether it's lynx or moose, in lieu of the changes that are happening in our climate. There will be changes to Maine's wildlife as we proceed into the future.
Well, I'd love to get into that, but we're out of time.
Okay.
Mark, thanks so much for joining me on Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
And that's Mark McCullough, Endangered Species Biologist for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. You must know somebody who wants to learn more about Maine Cougars. You're in luck. This show and all previous shows are archived on the web at 929theticket.com. Bob Duchesne's Wild Maine is brought to you by Hammond Lumber, Napa Auto Parts, Doors Equipment, and EBS. We'll return next Saturday morning at 9 and Sunday morning at 8. This is Sports Radio 929 The Ticket.